The 20th century was exciting for comics as a medium. It was the century where comics flew the nest and became an independent medium from newspaper. Originally, comics were mostly published in newspapers, either in the strip format or as a one-page Sunday special. And there is a whole video I could make about newspaper comics, but not today. Today I want to talk about the 3 traditions that dominated comics in the 20th century and what I love about all of them. Throughout these intense 100 years of evolution, 3 global markets evolved around the creation of extended comic narratives outside the strip format. And those were the Franco-belgian BD scene, the American comic book scene, and the Japanese manga scene. What I would like you to do here is have a look at how these markets shape the way in which these comics are made and how these differences have created an array of storytelling techniques that you can use in your own comics or just enjoy as a viewer. First, let's look at the core attributes of these 3 traditions and their differences. Franco-Belgian comics are most famous for its full-color, self-contained stories, published mostly in lush hardcover albums. These albums are most often created by a single person or by a team of writer-artists. And these creators are also often the owners of the copyright. Although in some cases they later decide to sell the rights to the publisher, maybe because they're retiring and they want to allow their series to continue, as in the case of the creators of Asterix and Obelix. These albums are not only typical of France and Belgium, and they also happen in other countries around Europe. For example, in Spain we have Blacksad, a beautifully watercolor, traditionally illustrated book, and Italy's modern classic Corto Maltese are both good examples of the use of this format in other countries in Europe. The most popular genre in this market is the travel genre, where a set of fixed characters travel to different locations in each album, encountering new characters and challenges. As a little girl, one of the things I loved the most about Asterix and Obelix was the feeling that you were going along with them in all of these countries and adventures, exploring their culture, history, and above all, their gastronomy, because I don't know what it is about cartoon food, but I could just taste the food in those pictures and stare at it all day. Secondly, we have the Japanese manga scene. Born after the Second World War, this market took influence from American cartoons, and this is why they have the big eyes and the stylized characters. But it built on this influence and injected into it the rich cultural history of Japanese folklore as well as the art tradition, creating a unique combination that is, as of today, the biggest comic market in the world. Last but not least, we have the American comic book scene. Comic books are typically 20 to 25 page softcover books that were originally printed in newspaper paper. Its characteristic size of 10 and 1/8 of an inch by 6 and 5/8 of an inch is a product of merely folding a 30s newspaper into 4 and stapling it to form a booklet. These were created back in the 30s and were called 10-cent floppies, and they gave rise to an entire market of cheap comics for young children. The original objective of the 10-cent floppy was to create a cheap children's publication that could be distributed in kiosks and shops. That market soon boomed, and its original content of funny strips soon evolved to an array of genres, from action to romance and horror and everything in between. But in the 40s, after Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created Superman, superheroes became king. Especially after the implementations of the Comics Code as a form of censorship, which created a great friction with romance, war, and horror comics, and kept the all-American superheroes dominant in the market for many years to come. For many, as a result, comic books have become synonymous with superheroes, but there is much more to this tradition than that. Now that we have a clear idea of what 3 traditions we're talking about and what they more or less represent, let's have a look at how these production models and how these markets had affected the way in which these comics read and look and feel. The way comics are produced and distributed and the relationship between the creators and their publishing houses have marked how these comics are made. Creators inside these 3 scenes have had to adapt in creative ways to the demands of the publishers and the limitations and expectations of the markets. Therefore, the way I see it, these different traditions excel at different aspects of comic creation, and there is something I love about all of them. So let's have a look at how they compare and what they excel at. Manga is the most different to its counterparts in the way that it's produced and published. In fact, if I had to label manga production as the exact opposite of one of these models, is the exact opposite of the Franco-Belgian model. American production would be somewhere in between the two. Most of the manga we get in the West is published in thick magazines that contain an array of titles. These magazines are published in cheap paper, and series that are successful within these magazines later get published in volumes that are called tankobons. These magazines are published as regularly as weekly, and titles compete for popularity to retain their space inside the magazine. If a title loses the interest of the public, then the title is dropped and a new manga is given an opportunity to be published. This means that even established authors will not retain their space in the magazine regardless of their net value and regardless of how famous they are. Masashi Kishimoto, the author of Naruto, has been dropped from Shonen Jump in his latest series because it's not performing as well as they should, so it doesn't matter that he had one of the most successful long-running series inside the magazine. If the comic's not doing well, it gets dropped. This is an extremely competitive environment with very tight deadlines, and in some cases the deadlines for the 20-so page chapters are only of 1 week. This means that each creator has to produce 20 pages every week, the entire year. And if you have followed any long-running manga like I have, you will have noticed that hiatus weeks are very, very rare, even in series that go on for 10 years or longer. This work rhythm is obviously impossible, so despite the long hours and great efforts, mangakas have to hire teams of assistants to help them with the production of pages, much in the same way that animation studios hire entire teams to animate a film. Most professional mangakas, in fact, start their career as assistants to other original titles from the magazines they aim to be in. Once their original title gets accepted into the magazine, they move on to become the mangaka and hire their own assistants. This working environment is often portrayed by former assistants and mangakas themselves as an extremely unhealthy environment where only true workaholics can survive. As I mentioned, European production is pretty much the opposite. Albums may take 1 year or more to come out, and their publication is treated like an event. These are luxury products, beautifully published, hardcover, lush coffee table books. Their publication is treated like the publication of any work of fiction. When the album comes out, a number of copies are made depending on the publisher's sales estimates, and if it sells well enough, future issues are contracted. European production is therefore focused on creating high-quality products that will sell well when presented to customers. Mangas, on the other hand, are pitched against other mangas in the same genre and demographic, and only the most popular ones get published outside the magazines. So some mangas are born dead and can never get compilation volumes or tankobons, especially if they're competing with very popular series. As a result, mangakas are less likely to risk experimenting with storytelling and art than European albums. American comic books represent this middle ground between these two models of production, creating serialized content with editorial constraints and expectations just as manga, but not as intensely focused on pitching comics against each other to test popularity. They are more focused on sales. In fact, American publishers often schedule releases to maximize sales for all of their titles, rather than release all similar titles at the same time and together to pitch them against each other. The production mentality in America, however, was much more intense than the European. Just as manga, American comics throughout the 20th century aimed to hook the reader to an ongoing story by providing 20-odd page installments with exciting stories that left the reader wanting more. But there is one key difference. In Japan, publishers and mangakas have a shared ownership of each IP, meaning that the mangaka is not hired by the publisher. It's a partner. Whatever benefits come out of the sales of tankobons, rights to animation companies, or merchandising is shared by the mangaka. In the US, on the other hand, the big two, Marvel and DC, own the rights to all the characters and they hire creators to make the comics. But these creators won't earn a penny from anything other than their page rates. Of course, there are contracts that stipulate some later gain, but these creators do not own any part of the characters that they're drawing. This IP policy over time rubbed creators the wrong way in America, and so underground, independent, and creator-owned publishing models emerged in the US, creating a vibrant scene of great experimentation and creativity. In turn, this subversion and creativity succeeding outside the Big Two fed the Big Two ways of getting out of their own ruts. So while both American and Japanese markets are mainly focused on providing affordable entertainment for young people, there is a stronger experimental side to the US market because of the IP policy results. The production model also affects the way these comics actually look. Japanese comics are produced mostly in black and white exclusively to make the production faster, whereas traditional Franco-Belgian comics and American comics are colored. Another effect the production model has on mangas is that, unlike European comics, mangas don't strive to be concise in storytelling. They strive only to be entertaining. Mangas often stretch stories where a European album always tries to tell a complete story in one volume. Deadlines probably play a great role in this because conciseness requires extra work in the part of the writer. Plus, if a mangaka can hit a 20-page deadline with a double-page spread with one illustration, they won't shy away from it. After all, they are guaranteed a platform with readers for as long as they can entertain them. So it is not rare to see manga pages with just one sprawling illustration or 2 or 3 panels, whereas in Europe it's not that common to see that type of panel, and in fact 8+ panel pages are more common. The result is that manga tells slower stories with much more contemplative or emotional moments. And also, they tend to use sprawling casts of characters that for the most part will get arcs focusing on the individual development of each character. Classic Franco-Belgian comics tend to use static characters that don't develop, and the interest comes from their interaction with a changing world or a new environment or challenge. I sometimes like to compare the manga storytelling techniques to those of South American and Central American telenovelas. We have big cliffhangers, intense emotional moments, and sprawling casts of characters that constantly make very outrageous choices. Another effect of tight deadlines is that they have created some interesting conventions in both American and Japanese comics. One being tight clothing for superheroes, because drawing a naked dude and painting him blue is easier than having to think about all the folds and clothes dynamics that happen during a fight. So we can all thank deadlines for spandex costumes. On the other hand, non-tight deadlines have generated one of my absolute favorite features of Franco-Belgian comics. These books are gorgeous. Albums tend to come out once a year, if at all, so creators and publishers take a long time making them as beautiful as possible. And yes, I know there is beautiful work in other comics around the world, but on average, you don't see these lush, hand-painted, beautifully bound hardcover books as often in other markets. The latest European comic I bought was Ultra Laser Volume 2, and to me there is something exciting about waiting an entire year for a comic to come out and then seeing this lush, hardcover, beautifully published book in front of me. But when I read this book, I am entirely aware of the fact that the emotional moments are not quite as effective as those in manga or American comics. I can't say that I've often cried reading an European comic. Maybe, Ethel and Ernest, that makes me cry. But then again, Ethel and Ernest is not a European album. It's a complete different expression of the medium, and that is a conversation for another day. But when reading Naruto and when reading Dragon Ball, man, I've cried many times, and I'm not ashamed to say it because they are designed to make you cry. They are designed for emotional response, and that is one of the reasons why manga is so popular. So on the one hand, artistically speaking, I love European comics, but on the other hand, if I want to have a strong emotional reaction, I will go straight to manga. One last thing that I like to point out about the model of production is serialization. Serialization is understood very differently in these 3 publishing contexts. In manga, serialization is understood as a week-by-week commitment to making the story exciting. Many mangas, when they are popular, stretch the storylines as much as possible. Because as long as the comic is doing well, merchandising will keep on selling and the publisher will always be happy to give them a platform. Serialization in America doesn't quite work the same way. Firstly, because of the IP policies. The big two will always want their characters to be in the limelight. However, they won't overstretch a story to the point that manga does it. Because at the end of the day, when that run of that character ends, they can start a new one. And because of the popularity of the character, people will always buy the first issue to give it a chance. In fact, one of the moments where publishers sell the most copies is when they restart a franchise. So a number 1 of Superman will always sell better than a number 1500 of Superman. I haven't followed superheroes very closely, and I would like someone to tell me if this is the case, but I doubt that any American hero has gone on a run for 1,000 installments. But in manga, we have One Piece about to hit 1,000 very soon. I think they're 970 something as of March 2020. So basically there's a big difference between the way we understand serialization in the West and the way they understand serialization in the East. Serialization in manga is understood as the same story stretched over a huge number of years, but the manga will end when this protagonist reaches their ultimate goal. In the case of One Piece, it is to become the king of pirates, and he hasn't achieved it yet, so he's still on that journey. However, in the West, both in Europe and in America, serialization is linked to character. You have characters that are loved and known by a large amount of people, such as, for example, Batman. And every time we have a new run of Batman, the story restarts. New challenges are put in front of them. New enemies are put in front of them, and a new reading of that same character happens. So, serialization is not about stretching the same story for many, many years. It's about reimagining these stories once and again and again. In the European case, it's slightly different. So what happens in Europe is you have some characters that are very popular, for example, Tintin, and what happens in these serializations is that Tintin is put in different situations. So the whole story is different, but the story is not reset. So whatever characters Tintin met in the first volume will still be his friends in the third volume, and they will remember the adventures they had together. The effect these types of serialization has in storytelling is also quite stark. On the one hand, American comics excel at reinterpreting in different ways the same characters. So we have different reading, different interpretations of these characters by different writers and different artists. So you can see the same character with 1,000 different optics, and that can be extremely interesting. I remember reading Superman Red Son, and I thought that was one of the most interesting things I've ever read. That's the story basically of Superman if he had fallen in a Russian farm rather than an American farm, and he was a defender of communism rather than capitalism. And that was a really interesting storyline, and I don't think you would be able to see that in manga because those characters are on a quest, and when they finish that quest, they're supposed to just stop existing. The mangaka is supposed to just move on to another story. European comics serialization also creates an interesting thing, and is seeing the same character unchanged, interacting with different things in the world and different types of people. So it's very interesting, for instance, to see Obelix interacting with the cuisine of different cultures. And even though Obelix is never going to stop being a lover of boar and a person who loves eating lots of meat, I remember reading Asterix and Obelix in Brussels and just loving the fact that Obelix was given this Brussels sprout soup and he had to eat it. It's just fun to see these characters that you know so well interact with the world and be able to experience these things through their eyes. So all of these types of serialization create different experiences, and to me, all of them are super fun. I love the results that they create, and I love how different contexts put different creative barriers for creators, and yet all these creators manage to deliver something interesting, entertaining, and beautiful, even with the constraints of a market and the expectations of the public waiting on them. And in my opinion, this is the thing that I love the most about these three comic traditions, how creators and publishers have found ways to adapt to the limitations of the medium in their own context, and to create expressions of this medium and possibilities for this medium that would have never existed had they had all the freedom in the world. I am excited to see what the 21st century is going to do with its new promises, limitations, and expectations, and what comics will become in this new century. But I think if we look back, we can learn loads about how to overcome creative challenges and limitations from these great 3 traditions. Let me know your thoughts about these 3 traditions and which one do you like best, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye!